Okay, well, I think we're live, but we're just going to give it a few more seconds to let people come into the room here. Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to P&P Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine. And we have what promises to be a very thoughtful and very engaging program for you this evening, featuring journalist Evan Osnos, talking about his new book, WILDLAND, The Making of America's Fury. A couple of brief housekeeping notes first, though. To post a question at any point during the discussion, just click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. And in the chat column, you'll find a link for purchasing copies of WILDLAND. Evan's a great reporter who, in the early 2000s, moved overseas where he ended up staying for a decade as a foreign correspondent. Initially, he reported from the Middle East for the Chicago Tribune, then went to China for the Trib, and in 2008, shared a Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting. That year, he also joined the New Yorker and stayed in China for several more years before coming back to the United States and settling in Washington, D.C., where he's been covering politics and foreign affairs for the New Yorker and writing books. His excellent book about China, Age of Ambition, won the National Book Award and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. In his book last year, Joe Biden, about our current president, became a bestseller. But for the last 7 or 8 years, since his return from living abroad, Evan has also been working on another project. This one has involved trying to understand the serious political fragmentation and polarization in the United States, the erosion of some of our nation's foundational beliefs. And that's what WILDLAND is about. As he says in the prologue, while he was overseas encountering people who tended to be critical of the US, he'd often make the case that for all America's failings, it remained committed to several bedrock principles, like the rule of law, the power of truth, and the right of equal opportunity. After coming back to this country and seeing how much things had changed, he wondered if he'd been lying to others and to himself. So to figure out what had happened and why, he did some deep reporting dives in 3 economically and culturally different communities he knew already firsthand: Clarksburg, West Virginia, Chicago, Illinois, and Greenwich, Connecticut. In WILDLAND, he combines close-up stories of individuals from these places with broad perspectives on societal change, producing overall quite a compelling and insightful narrative. In early reviews, Kirkus called the book an elegant survey of the causes and effects of polarization in America. And Publishers Weekly described it as an engrossing and revealing look at how deeply connected, yet far apart, Americans are. Now, in conversation with Evan will be Jiayang Fan, a fellow staff writer at the New Yorker and the first Chinese-born staff reporter at the magazine. She's also at work on her first book, Motherland, due for publication in 2023. So Evan and Jiayang, take it away.
Thanks, Brad.
Thank you, Brad. I couldn't be happier to be here, Evan, partly because I feel like I always want to see you and we're never actually in the same in the same city. But I also, I was showing Evan earlier, my very, heavily annotated copy of the book, and it occurred to both Evan and me that it was the first time that we were discussing an annotated piece of his work post-publication. I'm actually very proud of the fact that I was Evan's fact checker many years ago.
Lucky me. I have you saved me. I don't know how many times, that's for sure.
No, I was completely spoiled by the quality of Evan's annotations, and I was a fact time checker. And by the time I kind of came on full board, I realized some other writers who shall not be named will just give you kind of wiki printouts as their facts. So what really, not surprisingly, what always impressed me about you and your work, Evan, is your humility and your diligence. And when I learned that you were from Greenwich, it did not compute. You really threw me for a loop, and partly because I also spent years of my childhood in Greenwich. And even though my sampling was limited, given the people that I interacted with and, the number of years I was there, I was really perplexed by a Greenwich native who doesn't reflexively enter the finance industry and who doesn't wear their arrogance kind of as a badge of pride. And I really was wondering to myself, what kind of defective Greenwich native are you, Evan? And this book, which so beautifully weaves together the lives of those from three very distinct places: Chicago, Clarksburg, West Virginia, and Greenwich. I mean, I've only really known one of those places very well, which is Greenwich. And a core theme of the book is how insular we can become, in the places that we live and call our homes, and how foreign places actually very geographically close to us can be. I have to admit that, my story is very different from yours, Evan. I also was just so delighted to learn kind of all these bits of, personal history about Evan from the book. Like I had no idea that your mother was a WASP born in Morocco, and that your dad was a Jewish refugee born in India, and they met in Saigon during the Vietnam War. I mean, this was all,
Yeah.
You're much more international than I thought, Evan. Even before you were born.
Even before we met, I know.
But our path to Greenwich is very different. Even though both of us, grew up there. And what my impression of Greenwich as the child of an immigrant who explicitly brought us there so that I could reap the benefits of its elite education system was, for the first actually for many years in the US, I equated white people with WASPs.
Wow.
I thought Greenwich white people were the only kind of white people in the US. And that, illusion really, I think, tracked me for some time. And it took me, a while to understand how diverse in every sense the US is. I want to begin by just asking about your experience of growing up in this town. And obviously I feel like diligence is maybe a habit that was part of kind of your personality fairly early on, and clearly thoughtfulness. But did you think that Greenwich was just one town and that there were many like it in the rest of the US the way I did? Or were you a little bit even more informed, even as a child, than I was?
Oh, it's such an interesting question. I have to say, and before I answer, I just want to tell you what a pleasure this is. I've been looking forward to this event. Jiayang, you and I, as some people will know if they read the New Yorker, we've sort of had this going back years. We've worked together on pieces, and I, from the very first piece I wrote, you and I have worked together, and I've just been your biggest fan. And I'm just so thrilled to see what's happening now and to have the chance to have this conversation. And for folks, I know there are people who are tuning in who will have read every word that Jiayang has written, but if you haven't read particularly the piece Motherland, which is going to be the basis for the book that you'll read later, it's just one of the most extraordinary pieces that the New Yorker has ever published, and it's been publishing for a very long time. And I'm not the first person to describe it that way. It's just an extraordinary piece of work about parents and children and about countries and about sort of nationhood. And I learned so much from it, as I have from you over the years. And I learned about Greenwich, in fact, from that piece. I mean, so, you know, for people who don't know, your mom is this extraordinary person of fortitude who decided upon landing in the United States, and you'll correct me if this is wrong, but she said to people essentially in New York, she said, tell me where is the most prosperous place around where my kid can get the best start in life. And they said, go to Greenwich. And she got a job working in a house, cleaning the house, and you were essentially there sharing a twin bed. Do I have that right?
Yes. I mean, that made me, when I was reading your book, I thought so much about my mother's mindset, because because, you know, this book explores so much of the way that the game has been rigged in the
Yeah.
US, and of you know, kind of this assumption that some are aware, that some hold and others, you know, kind of are unaware of, that there is no way that pure, you know, force of will can get you to the elite ranks that you need
Yeah.
to be. So my mother and I were interlopers in Greenwich for a long time, because I think she was aware. I mean, she was a very ordinary doctor
Yeah.
in China, and you know, she was a party member, so, you know, she, in some ways, you know, we were already privileged, but she was by no means part of the, you know, the elite
Yeah.
you know, party bureaucracy. And I think she knew before she even learned, you know, English, that you had to get to the best zip codes
Yeah. Right.
in the US to then reap the benefits of, you know, tax dollars, and then the education system. And my mother, for a long time, I mean, I thought we both pronounced Greenwich as Greenwich, and
Right.
I was confused why a Greenwich was the mascot of this town that was supposed to be, you know, very wealthy, and that was, you know, that was my introduction to the place. So I was already somewhat aware of its advantages, and that
Yeah.
my mother was willing to, you know, to make the sacrifices to be in menial labor, I mean, to be a
Yeah.
housekeeper to in this town. But even I think, was somewhat you know, ignorant of just how vast that
Yeah.
gap between Greenwich and the rest of like America and the
Yeah.
world was. And
Yeah.
I just I'm curious, what was and I, you know, I always wondered, was that because I was an immigrant? Was that because I was so deficient in kind of understanding American culture and kind of Northeast culture? What, I mean, for you, someone, you know, a homegrown son of Greenwich, you know, were you aware of its privileges?
Yeah. I think yes is the answer. I sort of come to it in a slightly oblique way. You know, you described at the outset with my family as this kind of mishmash of different traditions, and you know, my father's side of the family, my mother's side of the family, all kind of, you know, scrambled together. And then we moved around when I was a kid because my dad was a newspaper reporter. And then by the time I was about 10 years old, we moved out to Greenwich, and they enrolled me in what are, by any definition, some of the world's greatest public schools. And it was just a sort of almost a ludicrously fortunate place to grow up, because you know, you almost have to go out of your way as a kid in my position to fail, because everything has been stacked to my advantage. I mean, let's be clear-eyed about it. That's the case. And I'm sort of aware of that, partly, I think, because we'd lived overseas, and because I grew up with this kind of muscle memory of my father's family, particularly. He came to the United States as a refugee, and so much of his life was defined by never letting that kind of instability happen again. And that meant a lot of different things. But one of them was that when there was this chance to move to a place that was kind of a byword in American history for opportunity and prosperity and making it, it was like, you know, we went. And I think one of the things that's so interesting is to point out, and this is a theme that runs through the book, is that there, even within a place like the history of Greenwich, Connecticut, which is, by any definition, one of America's wealthiest places, there have always been these gradations and change over time that are really important, that I think are also part of the story of how we get to now in our politics. When I was growing up, it was a wealthy place, certainly, and that was a big piece of how it existed in the world. But it was not what it is today in the sense of the degree of just on a sheer statistical basis. I mean, to put a couple numbers behind it, in 2004, after things began to grow really sort of dramatically, the hedge fund fortunes began to grow. And this was because the dot-com bubble had burst and because interest rates were low after 9/11. And you had this extraordinary profusion of cash into the hedge fund world. There was a ranking that was done of the 25 wealthiest hedge fund managers or most successful hedge fund managers in the previous year. And of the 25, 10 of them lived in this one town. And they had made, on average, about $207 million the previous year, not lifetime, previous 1 year. And all of that was coming into town at this extraordinarily concentrated rate. I remember talking to a minister who I quote in the book, who said to me, I had never ministered to a flock that was contending with such a monoculture. And I thought that was such a powerful idea. It gets to something that you were talking about before about barriers, the barricades, essentially, the ways in which we encircle our worlds, either deliberately or passively. And that, in the end, was really sort of the basis for what this whole book is about, is this idea that because of politics and economics and ultimately technology too, we have erected these barriers around ourselves and we operate in kind of ingrown ways, to the point that I think a lot of folks are less aware of the rest of the country, less aware of vulnerability and suffering than they even would have 2 generations ago. And I'm not saying there was like a golden age of American empathy when we were all sort of, let's state the obvious. We've had massive violent struggles over racial progress, in the same period of time that there was also some post-war sense of connectivity. And part of the reason why I sort of draw this nuanced view of it is because I think if we say that there never was a greater awareness of other places, then it's also sort of almost exculpating the president, because what we're doing is saying things haven't gotten worse when they have gotten worse in measurable ways. And so I sort of like to be able to say, just because they were bad doesn't mean they couldn't get worse, if that makes any sense.
No, it absolutely does. And what I found so kind of marvelous in this portrait, in this finely, woven kind of portrait of the U.S. through these two, through West Virginia, Chicago, I mean, to some extent, DC and Greenwich, is the way in which, that on one end of the spectrum, the rich find continuously new ways of justifying how what they have, the ludicrous sums that they have earned is the result of, capitalism kind of working at its finest and meritocracy, while those in, at the bottom rungs, I mean, those in, West Virginia and in, in inner city Chicago, I think can't even comprehend or can't even imagine what they have been deprived of, or the kind of possibilities that they can't live out ever. And that distance was astonishing to me. And I think that the book, it both gives us such vivid senses of the lives lived in these places, some through your experience, your interviews, some through even portraits of your family members, and other just kind of like, I mean, understanding kind of how these forces have, what kind of forces have caused this, this kind of gap. Is that something, I mean, when you were going, I know that, you started the book, years ago, and that it, in 2014, was it? Or?
Yeah, I mean, it was basically some of the reporting that I was doing in 2000, it was really though 2015 where I got the anyway, that was really the sort of kernel. It was really when, honestly, it was when Trump entered presidential politics in a serious way that I began to see him as this sort of profound symptom of distress. And we can have a whole other easy conversation about the ways in which he was a malevolent origin of problems. But in some ways, I found like the missing piece of the puzzle was, how did he happen? How did he become possible? And in many ways, I think of him as perhaps our most sort of secluded American. Here he is. He lived literally in an apartment with his name on the building in a city that he had barely ever left in any meaningful way. He didn't like to sleep outside of town. He was like a walking expression of tailoring one's experience to maximize the most, to sort of exclude any unsavory sensory input. It's like and so he was kind of this expression of this phenomenon that we've been talking about, of kind of turning inward. And I became fascinated by that. I sort of wanted to understand how that came to be.
Yeah, I mean, and the book, I mean, so, explores, I loved, in the book, you talk about, him and Jared Kushner, both these kind of American big adult sons who have just been so egregiously insulated by their privilege, who then are ruling kind of a country that they fundamentally do not understand, but that in some ways they're expert at exploiting. I wanted to ask about, because the book started 6 years ago, did you find that your thesis was evolving as you were writing? Because we come up all the way to the present, to January 6th of last year, and I wanted, what was the process of writing like? What was the evolving kind of nature of the thesis? I mean, how did that come about?
Well, it was, I mean, to in some ways, the conditions of the last couple of years in which we've had this absolute avalanche of events, each one of which could constitute an entire shelf of nonfiction literature. I mean, you could devote an entire genre to the pandemic, or to the protests against racial injustice, or to the effort to steal a presidential election and then dispute the Democratic result. I mean, any one of these. And so on some level, I think if somebody was embarking on a book at that period, it's actually quite alarming as a writer to think, oh my God, how do I possibly situate these things in any conversation with each other? I actually had a completely different experience, because at that point I was, this sounds a little funny, but I basically regarded each one of these moments as proof of concept that the series of things that were happening were in fact confirming evidence. To take one at a time, COVID just was in a sense this moment that was like an X-ray of our national governance and the failures of our politics. The fact that somebody as radically incompetent as Donald Trump could find himself in the presidency was only made clearer by a moment in national life that called on him to summon, to use a word loosely, his knowledge of science. I mean, that moment was actually, it told us more about the way that we choose people to go into government and the failures of that process than it did anything else. Then you take the fact of the Black Lives Matter protests, and the movement was in its own way a kind of a final expression of what had been building in such clear terms on the neighborhood level. And, if you were in Chicago, and I'll give you, an example of one of the people who I write about a lot in the book is a guy named Maurice Clark. Mm-hmm. And he was like a pretty brilliant student. As a kid, he was like naturally good at math, and he was living in a very, very distressed neighborhood that had an inferior elementary school. And his mother said, no, you're not going to that elementary school. I'm gonna send you to the one that I can get us into across town. He was bused across to another elementary school, and he was thriving there. And then when he got to high school, the system does not pay for bus fare for high school students at this point. And it was one of those little tiny moments, Jiayang, that I think of as like, it was like a fork in the road that had there been a system, a program that might have provided bus fare for Maurice Clark so that he could go to the other high school that he wanted to go to, the entire trajectory of his life could and almost certainly would have been different. As he put it to me once, very sort of dryly, he said, "So began my life of crime." And the truth is, when he went to Fenger High School, he ended up following his brothers into the Gangster Disciples. He went off to prison, and there is just an extraordinary story of what happened to him after that. But in the particulars, I often remember reading, as I'm reading a lot of the coverage of the Black Lives Matter movement, and I was going to protests and writing about what I was seeing, I was thinking to myself that it was almost like an X-ray of something that had been visible lying in plain sight. And the title of this book is kind of relevant because I chose this idea of wildland, not actually referring to what it has sort of come to mean to, I think, many readers, which is just the sense that we are living in this sort of chaotic environment politically. It's actually referring to something very specific, which is a wildland fire, which is that it is a wildfire that has been building. The sort of ammunition, the fuel for this fire was growing and drying and desiccating right in front of us for 30 years. And it was only going to take a spark to light it. I ended up, I quote, as you remember, I quote Chairman Mao, who said all it takes is a single spark to start a prairie fire. Yeah. And that's how it felt to me. If it hadn't been Donald Trump, honestly, something else would have done it. But it was this accumulated moment, this accumulated cascading set of failures that made him possible.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's captured so well in the book, through, as, in these kind of, remarkably detailed interviews. I also was I was impressed by the way that even kind of earlier on, many years before the COVID pandemic, you have these metaphors of the way that, of the virus and the kind of, and the lack of accountability that becomes contagious, much earlier on. Yeah. And it made me think about how a society is hollowed out from the inside. And it also, it makes me think a lot about China, a country that you're very familiar with. And what I kept thinking about, I mean, I think you write about it so well in the book, is that in a society where the levers of accountability kind of are removed by the extraordinary power that select individuals hold, there's this sense that if you are not taking advantage of what you are permitted to do, then somehow you are not almost kind of manifesting your best self. And that mentality becomes so pervasive and contagious. And in Greenwich, I mean, it kind of it extends in every single kind of arena of life, from these really unscrupulous deals, that are being made in the financial sector, to the frantic, rat race in terms of getting into the best schools and wanting to accumulate as much prestige as possible. And I was thinking about kind of just how, in China, and I love the way that you compare and contrast China and the U.S. throughout the book, kind of the absence of democracy and of kind of a working political system in which people feel represented, means that everyone thinks that if they're not taking advantage of what they of what they have accrued through whatever means they have found, then they're not living their best life, or they are somehow a sucker. So I mean, did you and you contrast and compare and contrast your experiences in both countries so vividly in the book. I wondered where, I mean, kind of what you made of that, and whether you think that the US can be only a few steps short of the complete kind of like amorality that you see in in China, and whether China is only a few steps away, kind of with the right political grounding, can be a version of the US. I mean,
yeah, it's such an interesting point. I mean, I came back to the US in 2013 at this really interesting moment, because in China, as you know, there had been this growing sense of corruption just bursting the boundaries of any historical precedent. I mean, corruption has been around forever in China in some form, as it has in many places, but it had just gone completely berserk. And we'd all written about these examples of, a low-level civil servant who'd accumulated 100 apartments or something like that. And oftentimes in China, I mentioned this in the book, I would have these conversations with people where friends in China would say to me, or people I'd encounter would say, do you have corruption like this in America? And I remember now almost a little bit sheepishly saying, well, no, because we've got rule of law and we've got vigilant courts and there's systems. You can't hack the system the way you can here. And I was, I don't want to say that I was kind of imperious about it, but I think I was a little smug in the knowledge that I would come home and I would be sort of reminded of how reliable the system. And I came back at a moment when I moved to Washington, and the governor of Virginia, who held the seat once held by Thomas Jefferson, had been charged with corruption for the most outrageous set of things. He had taken more than $100,000 from a political patron. He'd been riding around in his sports car, going to his house on the weekends, and all of it to sort of advance this patron's political goal. He'd been trying to get the state to review this medicine that he was making. And I looked at it and I said, oh my God, I really am out. I did not acknowledge to myself just how the system could be abused. And to quote the old line, it is not that what's illegal that's the scandal, it's what's legal. And the end of that story is that Bob McDonnell, who was the governor of Virginia, was at first convicted, and then the Supreme Court threw out his conviction because they said it didn't satisfy the threshold for public corruption. And legal scholars will tell you that that decision has been really catastrophic, because it has meant that things that should be, by any reasonable definition of corruption, should not be allowed, but they are now allowed under the law. That has been chastening, honestly, Jiayang. I've sort of, part of the process that I think I'm writing about in this book is a bit of coming to terms with the ways in which I think some of the mythology that we believe, we hold fast to, it's really deeply held. It is both part of our strength, I think, as a people, as a culture, as a nation, and also it can be a bit of a fantasy. And the fantasy is that it is static and it's fixed, and that we somehow kind of are redeemed by it. When in fact, what this book lays out is that it is fragile, and it degrades in our hands if we don't call it out and name the people and the places that are doing damage to it. And I will say, I also come away, and this is sort of, I'd be curious what you make of this, but I come away with this sense also that there are people on the ground, and I talk about some of them in the book, who are doing projects that are willfully determined not to give in to the cynicism, to the idea that nothing is possible. And there are people, I mean, I'm thinking particularly of Jamal Cole in Chicago, who runs an organization that is devoted to basically taking kids from neighborhoods, highly segregated neighborhoods in which they have no exposure to the kinds of public goods that they should have access to, and taking them and bringing them across town to other parts of the city so that they feel some sense of ownership. They don't feel as if they're being excluded. And then on the other side, he takes white cops, rookie cops, and he brings them into predominantly Black neighborhoods. And the kids in those neighborhoods give them tours. And I mentioned this with the giant asterisk. This is not a solution. This is not what we're talking about. What I'm talking about, though, is that it is like a pinprick. It is about acknowledging that you can actually do something, and that it is not sort of out of our hands, and that we are captive to these grand forces. Because just as we got ourselves into this situation by a series of decisions, we get ourselves out of this situation by a series of decisions. And I think one of the things I came away with is that agency is both, it can be thrilling to know we have it, and it is also something we have to own. We have to recognize that we got ourselves into this mess by making choices.
Yes, I mean, it is by kind of the accrual of these small decisions, or some, but small but significant decisions
Yeah.
that kind of we get to the present. I mean, the Trump phenomenon, which you go into in the book. I mean, it just the way that politics and theater are conflated, and how Trump
Yeah.
wages a war on not only kind of like the facts, but the
Yeah.
existence of facts
That's
themselves.
totally it. Yeah.
And again, I mean, it made me think about China and the way
Yes.
that the
Totally
party
agree.
defends itself, because oftentimes the defense is always a distraction,
Yeah.
or it is comparing things that actually don't really have relevance. And you talk about in the book, I mean, kind of one of the remarkable things about advertising is that people, I mean, I'm really kind of, this is what I've retained from the book, is that
Yeah.
people hold on to information much more than they are willing, able to discern
Yes.
kind of that, whether that information is true or not. And I was happy. I was grateful to see that the book ends on this note of kind of guarded optimism, that not
Yeah.
all is lost, like you said. I mean, that there are people out there doing the kind of work, making the kind of decisions that resuscitates kind of not only kind of the foundations of democracy, but really kind of keeps it growing and thriving. But I
Yeah.
also wondered what you thought about the fact that information and disinformation, it's circulating like a virus. I mean,
Yeah.
the way that I don't know if you've read, like, it seems like COVID might never go away. It's just going to be part of how we operate from now on.
Yeah.
And disinformation and kind of the alienation, that all seems to be just part of the air that we breathe. I
Yeah.
mean, how do we I guess, how do we continue to feel like there are reasons for optimism, and to keep kind of the optimism alive?
There's this fascinating piece of history here that I think is relevant, which is that you were so right to draw this comparison to China, because when I was living in China, I remember I had this, I stashed a quote from Hannah Arendt that made a lot of sense to me, which was that in systems in which people are routinely lied to, they acquire what she called a peculiar form of cynicism, in which you refuse to believe anything at all, no matter how true.
Mhm.
And that helped me make sense for people. And exactly the kind of phenomenon I'm describing, where people just reflexively go through the day in places in China being like, that's a lie, that's a lie, that's a lie, and I'm self-protective.
Mhm.
And what I came to realize was actually that particularly in some places in parts of this country, in pockets of our political culture, like in parts of West Virginia, where people have been systematically lied to by the political interests that work at the behest of the coal industry in some cases, and people who feel as if they're essentially right to lie to people because they think that it's advancing their interests, that constant repetition of lies has a way of rubbing somebody's political energy away. And there's an extraordinary fact, which is that in 1960, West Virginia had one of the highest levels of voter turnout in the country, 75%. And if you fast forward to 2014, it was down to 46%. It had just been almost cut in half, one of the lowest levels in the country. And that was an emblem of sort of quiet recusal from politics. And part of the reason for that was that people came to believe that they were being lied to so much that what was the point? And there was something about this that really resonates with my experience in China. I remember at one point with a friend who was a Chinese journalist had said, hey, you guys at the New Yorker, you and Jiayang do this incredible fanatical fact-checking process. It was actually, you know what it was, Jiayang? It was somebody that you had called on a fact-checking call, and he'd been sort of blown away at the level of rigor. And he said, you know what? We need to do an event. He said, let's do a public event in Beijing about fact-checking. And he said, we'll just put out the call. If people want to come, you can explain the fact-checking process. And I said, sure, okay, I'll do it. I figured, we'd get a few, reporters would come or students. And I show up to this thing, and there were 300 people. I mean, people sitting in the aisles. It had nothing to do with me. It had to do with this doctrine, this idea of fact checking as this faith, almost an epistemological leap, a belief system.
Mm-hmm.
And then the transcript from that event was somebody typed it up, and it circulates on the internet. And people will come up to me, sometimes Chinese journalists or journalism students, and they'll say, hey, I read the fact checking tutorial that you gave. And I find that like extraordinarily hopeful, because what it tells me is that there is this desire, people really have this desire not to be deceived and to participate in a regime of truth if you can build out the systems to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And for all kinds of reasons that there are so many headwinds against it in China and headwinds against it in the United States. But I have been struck by the fact that over the last couple of years, fact checking as an idea, partly because Donald Trump was doing such violence to the idea of fact checking as an idea has acquired a certain intellectual glamour, the idea that it is something that is worth celebrating on its own. And so that is a sign to me that we have this longing for it, particularly when it's under threat.
Yes, and that made me think, I mean, I kind of triple underlined this in the book. You talk about in the book, you discuss the perpetual wars that we're stuck in, kind of the legacy of 9/11. And you also talk about the way that Trump capitalizes on kind of on the fear that he is able to generate and the insecurity that he generates, that keeps people in this kind of DEFCON 5 sort of posture, which makes them really kind of put on their survivalist helmet rather than thinking about facts, rather than kind of looking at kind of what is true and what is not true. And it made me think also about that the way that that is so much of how China works, that when you tell the citizenry that they are constantly under assault, that I mean, again, what Trump does beautifully, which the party has mastered this for a long time, is the us versus them.
Yep.
The us versus the enemy. And when you live in that mentality long enough, all you're looking out for is kind of your survival. There's nothing else. And how to get out from that kind of that sense of chaos, which I think is so toxic to the imagination, right? I mean, I was actually, when I was thinking about like trauma on a national scale, I was also looking at, trauma on the individual scale. And you talk about, kind of the veterans. I mean, that the devastating story of the veteran you mentioned, who, clearly was suffering from PTSD, but ended up, killing, 4 people. And the idea that, when you, part of trauma is that you feel like you still are always in this state of chaos that you can't get out of. And in a way that has, that is what Trump has been so brilliant at doing, at kind of, at capturing the country and keeping it in this state of, trauma. I know we're running out of time, but I wanted to kind of end on a positive note, which is that you write about how sympathy, having sympathy for others might be one of kind of the ways that we can rejuvenate ourselves out of this deadlock. And I wanted to ask just the question about kind of so much of this book is your travel to, across the U.S. and talking to people who kind of lived in circumstances that were probably so different from what you've known, and also your experience in the Middle East and in China. I'm so encouraged by your very existence in a way that that you're so, as I said, that you're this very defective Greenwich native who despite growing up with a fair amount of privilege, have had the curiosity to step out of that sense of insulation. What sometimes, makes me scared is that, from very privileged, affluent parents, I'll hear, well, my children will be stuck in this forever. Like they'll never actually have the curiosity or to venture outside of their bubble. Can you, what do you, and you are a father of, two adorable children now. I mean, what counsel do you have for cultivating a sense of sympathy and being kind of curious about the lives of others enough to kind of venture out of our bubble?
There's this absolutely marvelous prescription that Brian Stevenson, the civil rights leader and lawyer, uses, and it's sort of elegantly concise. And he tells people, he gives speeches, as you know, all over the place, and he tells people, get proximate, meaning get close to people who are suffering, because no matter how abstract your concern can be, no matter how much you actually say, I care about these political values, I care about doing something to help people who are suffering, you have to get proximate. As he describes the experience of being a first-year law student at Harvard, and he was interested in civil rights in a broad sense, but it wasn't until he went down and worked on cases of people on death row that it transformed his sense of his own capacity. And, I think oftentimes one of the things that they should do is have term limits on journalists in Washington, D.C. And I say this with love for the city where I live, but the honest answer is, there's a reason why foreign correspondents kind of get up and after 5 or 10 years go somewhere new and have to start learning all over. And you have to get dumb and you have to start over and you have to get proximate and you have to start by acknowledging what you don't know and closing your mouth and listening. And I often find that is a really powerful education. And it's not one that I dare say is predominant always necessarily in Washington. And so I sort of feel like a foreign correspondence approach has been really helpful. I'm just incredibly grateful to the places that have let me do it. And anyway, I'm eating into Q&A, so I should probably.
No, yes, I feel like I've just had so many questions that I haven't looked at, the many questions that have already kind of gathered here. I'm gonna read one aloud from Brent King, who says, Evan, for the last several years, I would say the only thing that will get us out of this dysfunctional government situation would be a disaster. Unfortunately, well, we have close to that with the pandemic, and we see that even vaccinations and masks are as polarizing as everything else. What does it take to fix this?
Yeah, it's a really astute question, because I think a lot of us, if you go back historically and you look at what can shock a country out of a trajectory of the kind the United States was on, particularly when it comes to radical income inequality. The lessons of history are a cause for concern. There's basically only 3 ways. You can either do it through war, through pandemic, or through revolution, which sounds awfully dire for an after-dinner talk of this kind. But the truth is, that is what history tells us. So when the pandemic came, there was a sort of piece of my mind that was saying to me, well, is this going to be the thing that is a moment of clarification, where we begin to see the stakes and we begin to see how dire things are? I actually, and I think as we all can agree, as we all know, that the powers of tribalism and delusion overwhelmed it. I mean, the numbers ceased to resonate with people. The idea that more than 600,000 Americans have been killed by this, and we are not, talking about it in the terms that we should, and that there are still people who deny essentially the gravity of it, is a sign of that we are still in the grip of this. But I will say, I am encouraged by the fact that if you look at the numbers today, basically 75% of American adults get it. They understand that the vaccine is proven science. It will save your life and it will protect vulnerable people. We are dealing with 25% of American adults who are participating in a kind of fantasy. And it is dangerous and it is damaging. But I actually like the fact that in the last couple of weeks, you've begun to hear political leaders, particularly the Biden administration, saying, no, we're not going to be captive to this, essentially the kind of intellectual mutiny of the few who don't understand what it is that science has given. And I think it's time to say, no. And in the end, that doesn't solve the problem for you that we're talking about, but it at least it can begin to prove to people that that in fact, science in fact have prevailed. And that, I think, that's important, because otherwise you just feed the cynicism we've been talking about.
We have another question from Goran Erickson, who, talks, he says, you went to Clarksburg, and this weekend he's been watching, things on streaming services, the Hillbilly Elegy on Netflix, and Mayor of Easttown. And, he says, your book isn't fiction, but do you think there's a growing interest in the Rust Belt among American intellectuals in the post-Trump era?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great question. And you know what, it's fun. An event like this tonight, I think we have to sort of acknowledge this is like the absolute ideal environment to be talking about ideas and to be talking about writing. I mean, we've Politics and Prose, the Harvard Bookstore, Books and Books. These are like the stations of the cross for literary Americans, for readers and for writers. So all of us, in a sense, have already we've already given permission to ourselves to want to learn. And I think there is in the world that you and I work in, I think there was an awareness, a moment in 2016 when we discovered, all right, not only had we failed to understand the distress that was bubbling up in particularly rural America, take for one fact, the fact that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan had visited twice the number of casualties on small towns and cities as on large places. But also that then the first layer of analysis, the kind of J.D. Vance Hillbilly Elegy, somewhat kind of, I think his book is pretty roundly reviled in Appalachia. And because there was a sort of conservative text that was driving what he was trying to do, we've now entered this other phase where you're hearing the voices of people on the ground telling stories of their own. And if there is one thing I hope I've tried to do in this book, it's to get out of the way and to give people a chance to sort of tell stories. That this book is extremely character driven, as you described, and it's because if you're doing your job right, you can avoid messing with it and just if you find the stories that tell themselves, then get out of the way. That's what I've tried to do, and I think I've learned a lot from people who've been doing this kind of work the last few years.
We have a question from Ronnie Gao, who says, who asks, what do you say to the political right in America, who may otherwise like your work, i.e. Age of Ambition, but don't agree with the political stance from which you write? I sometimes find myself having this conversation with political moderates. I mean, those who kind of subscribe to Sam Harris, who thinks that, I'm operating already from kind of deep within kind of like the leftist ideology. And I haven't found a good kind of response to this question. So I guess I would love to hear from you, so I can steal it, Evan.
Well, I think there is a specific dynamic that we're talking about too, which is that in a curious way, some of the things that I gravitate to when I write about China, things like the struggle between the individual and the state, and the struggle between the market and the party. Actually, if you step back for a moment, those are often ideas that are popular to American conservatives. And then actually, when I write about the United States, I'm pretty clear about the fact, look, I'm not a political writer in the sense that I'm making a political argument. But I have a lot of problems with the way the Republican Party has operated in this country over the last several decades. There's no mystery to that. You won't get far into the book without figuring that out. I have my problems with the way the Democratic Party has too. But I'm not seeking to persuade somebody of my political views. What I'm trying as best I can is to describe the United States with the same kind of tools that I use to try to describe China. And that's the project. The project is to try to understand a place with that small degree of distance that you get from being away and from coming home. And but I don't think there has to be a single unified theory of the sort of the individual versus the collective. And I will just add one other thing, which is that one thing I've come to believe very strongly is that, societies have these moments where we are swinging from one perception of ourselves as individuals to the other. And we tack back and forth. The United States has had moments in its history where it has been, particularly during the progressive era, has been kind of more mindful of that collective ethic. And in China, for reasons that are specific to China's recent political experience, that collective ethic is toxic in the eyes of many people because they say that got us in immense trouble. But these are separate situations, and I try to regard them on their own terms. I sort of try to give China the due of regarding it on its own terms, and I try to give America its own due.
We're a few minutes away from 9, and I'm sorry we won't be able to get to all these questions, but to end on a slightly more uplifting note, Cheryl Grave asks, what would you recommend for everyday Americans to help us get proximate and engage across differences, to move toward trust, curiosity with each other, and see the humanity in each other to help strengthen our fragile democracy?
Yeah, I will give you there's an extraordinary demonstration of this effect. There was the governor of Virginia was named Linwood Holton, and he came back from World War II, where he had been in the military and had been serving alongside people. He was a white man, and he'd been serving alongside people of all races and backgrounds. He came back to Virginia, and the task came before him about whether to implement the decision in Brown versus Board of Education, and he did it. And he encountered what became known, the term was massive resistance. In Virginia, many people disagreed with his decision. There was a sort of strong backlash against it. And people were asking him, Lynn Holton, how could you do such a thing as to embrace integration? And he said, look, when I was in the military, the people who I literally slept beside and worked beside were people who did not look like me. And the notion that we can have separate but equal schools is crazy to me. And I mention his story because his was an example of getting proximate. And you don't have to have military service. There are all kinds of ways. If I was going to choose one thing that I've learned out of this project, it is the power of, and I wish we had a word that didn't sound quite so earnest, but the power of service of some kind, of just simply putting yourself out into a community in which you will get yourself out of your own environment for an hour, for 2, for a day, for half a day. And there is just something extraordinarily powerful. In our job, Jiayang, we have the luxury of sort of being thrust into these environments, unfamiliar environments all the time. And so it's fortunate. And I sometimes actually ask, I sort of want to challenge myself to say, would I still be doing this as much if my job didn't allow for it and didn't require it? But there is just something powerful, and we're trying a lot, Sarah Beth, and I think about this with our kids, about how do we make sure that our kids are exposed to environments that are so different than their own. And so I put that before you as an answer, which is, in fact, it's kind of gloriously available to you. It is simply about putting yourself into contact with people who are working on something larger than themselves and don't always have the same background that you do.
And I will say that, what I've learned from this book, this isn't exactly a way of getting proximate, but I did think, the line that, I think you say in the prologue, changing the ways that we see, really resonated with me. And what I took away from this book is that, as an immigrant, I think I've always swallowed like very kind of whole the gospel of willpower, which is what my mother instilled in me. Like, if you want to get a Greenwich education, you literally move there with $20 in your pocket, and you become someone's maid. And she instilled that in me, and I think I didn't realize how deeply ingrained it has been in me, to almost, I think, an unhealthy degree, because I've always believed, well, if I want something bad enough, I can manifest it. And in reading, what was very poignant for me, and maybe, we'll end on this note, is that, reading the stories of the coal miners in West Virginia, and of, the petty criminal who didn't have to be a criminal in Chicago, and the war veteran turned murderer, is that all of them deeply wanted better, a good life, and were willing to work for it, but the sheer force of will was not enough to get them there, because of the structure that American society kind of, imposed on their lives. So I came out of the book. I came away from the book deeply chastened by my own, self-deception, and which has been, admittedly building for some time, that even as an immigrant, a working class immigrant, I had so, and kind of willpower is so deeply embedded in American mythology of itself, right? That if you just work hard enough, you can get there. And generations of immigrants have landed on its shores, hoping to, embrace that that ethos. And I've learned, through I guess now years of experience, but crystallized in WILDLAND, that it simply just isn't true, and that willpower will not get us there despite the best of intentions from
Thank you so much for reading this so closely and for thinking about it in your own terms. I can't thank you enough.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Evan.
Jiayang, it's so clear how moved you've been by Evan's book, and Evan, in a number of ways, you were so well suited to write the book that you have, coming back from abroad after a decade away with a fresh perspective, and then bringing to your reporting here not only what you'd learned about profiling another big, complicated country, China, but also knowing to anchor your story in this country in the individual stories of a range of people and communities already somewhat familiar to you. So your book's going to be on our recommended list at PNP for the upcoming holiday season, and I know those who read it will come away with a much better understanding of our country today. To everyone watching, thanks for tuning in. A reminder that in the chat column, you can find a link for purchasing copies of WILDLAND. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.